So let's welcome Angèle, Christin.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Scott, for this kind introduction. And I would like to thank all the organizers of the Design at Large seminar, as well as Tina Echo for making this visit possible. I'm very excited to be here. So it doesn't seem like I'm so far away. I'm just a couple of 100 miles north. But coming here, it feels like a vacation. Can you believe it? It's just warmer and just like you have cacti and it's just, anyway. Just small differences in California, turning them into big differences. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about algorithms in practice and give you an overview of the kind of research that I do. And we'll be talking about a range of different topics. So hopefully you won't have time to get bored. So I'm sure that it's the middle of the quarter, the end of the day, so it could happen, but I'll do my best. Let me start with a tiny bit of background. It won't be a surprise for anyone in the room. This is a data moment. Lots of big data, small data, giant data, fast data, slow data, data everywhere. Now, when we think about where does that data come from, and especially where is it implemented, we tend to think about tech giants, right? Most of which are located around the Stanford campus, so we get to see them very often. Facebook, Google, Amazon, all of the institutions that scholar Shoshana Zuboff describes as the main pillars of what she calls surveillance capitalism, right? That they're extracting data from individuals and then monetizing the data for aims that she finds problematic. Now, of course, Facebook, Google, Amazon are not the only platforms or the only places where data is being extracted and then implemented. We also see a multiplication of both data, algorithms, and analytics in many other social fields. In a way, it's kind of hard to find a field that is not being affected by the multiplication of platforms and computational procedures that comes with digital technologies. From finance to healthcare, education, policing, social services, you name it, every single field and organization is undergoing massive transformations because of this multiplication of computational technologies. Now, I'm in the computer science and engineering building with you today, and so I will say that the question of how we define algorithms is a tricky one. So for now, let me just say that I do make a distinction between data, algorithms, and analytics. Basically, data I think about as some kind of numerical information that can be used for a specific set of purposes. Is usually at the individual levels and not necessarily, usually digitals and not necessarily. Algorithms I kind of think about as a kind of computational procedures that kind of draw on that data and provide some kind of output through some kind of procedures that has a step-by-step components. They can be highly sophisticated or not. I don't really care about that. They can be online or offline. Same thing, most of the ones I study are online, but it's not necessary. And finally, analytics and metrics I think about as the outputs of algorithms, right? So you have the kind of data, algorithm, metrics, and analytics kind of tripartite structure. So in most software programs, they overlap. Right? So that's for the definitions. I'm happy to talk more about that. Usually computer scientists get very itchy when I talk about algorithms. It's like, but what do you mean by algorithms? Well, of course, social scientists usually don't really care about the definition of algorithms. Like, oh yeah, anything computational. And humanists, let's not even. They're just like, oh yeah, it's fine. So anyway, happy to get back to this. So knowing this multiplication of data, algorithms, and analytics across sectors, what is the current landscape of scholarship and media coverage around these questions? Well, unsurprisingly, over the past 5 to 10 years, there has been an exponential increase in the kind of scholarly analysis of the impact of these algorithms and analytics, or what sometimes people define as artificial intelligence. And most of that scholarship, I will argue, is characterized sometimes, not always, but often, but what I call algorithmic determinism, which is that we just pay a lot of attention to the constraining and negative aspects of the rise of these computational procedures. So people talk about the power and tyranny of algorithms and data. They talk about the oppression of algorithms. They talk about weapons of mass destruction. And what we see here is a picture of a kind of dystopian social world in which these kinds of technological procedures are constraining and reducing us to some kind of bondage, right? Some kind of servitude that most people find problematic. Now, we see three different versions of that argument about the kind of deterministic aspect of algorithmic technologies and their kind of effects. These three different versions have to do with standardization, surveillance, and bias. And I'll just talk a tiny bit about each one of them. So the first one is the idea that when you have an increase in algorithms, metrics, data, analytics, it tends to standardize the practices and identities and representations of the people being quantified. So that in turn is in fact a very old idea in the social sciences. It goes back to some extent to classical theorists of the 19th century, including Marx, and the idea that money can lead to commodification in the capitalist society. But we see more recent versions showing that, for example, when we are being ranked or when we are being quantified, we tend to start comparing each other in terms of these numbers. And when we start comparing each other in terms of these numbers, we kind of start imitating each other, not necessarily consciously, but there is this kind of like kind of convergence towards the means, right? And a recent version of this for the sociologists and social scientists in the room is recent work on law school rankings and the role of rankings on higher education. But we can also talk about online dating. It's kind of the same mechanism. For those of you who engage in online dating, it can lead to the same thing. I won't get into it, but I'm happy to talk more about it if people have questions. A second version of this argument about kind of algorithmic determinism and the constraining aspect of algorithms and analytics has to do with surveillance and control. And here's the idea that when you have multiplication of kind of platforms, algorithms, and analytics, it comes with a specific kind of power over the people who are being tracked, right? And that specific kind of power in turn is seen as problematic because the idea is that when we know that we are being tracked, so think about Google, right? We all know that we are being tracked by Google one way or another, or Amazon, I mean, you pick it really. We tend to internalize that surveillance. And we tend to adjust our actions. So say you're thinking of Googling something real problematic. You're going to think twice, probably, right? And you're going to engage in some kind of obfuscation procedure. So some of us may use incognito windows, some of us may go to DuckDuckGo, some of us may use Tor, whatever, right? But like some version of like, I'm not sure I want Google to know that I'm Googling this, right? And that can be for a variety of reasons. But this ideas that like algorithms and analytics and kind of data collection lead to kind of surveillance and control in turn is seen as having a chilling effect on how we express ourselves, right? So typically, an example that most people take is the one of social movements, that when social movement activists know that they are being tracked, they may be less likely to engage in truly transformative social action because they are scared of the repercussion. After all, that's how totalitarianism works, right? That's how surveillance works in many ways. So this idea of like data, surveillance, control, and kind of normalization at the kind of lowest common denominator. The third version of this argument is about bias and discrimination. So this is, I think, a kind of scholarship that has really grown over the past couple of years, and that is like an excellent development given the repercussions of the algorithmic systems that are being analyzed. But the main idea here is basically a kind of garbage in, garbage out process, right? So many institutions tend to apply or to develop algorithms with the idea that algorithms are more objective than human people, right? That humans make subjective decisions, that we're all biased in multiple different ways, and so that by relying on mechanical ways of making decisions, we can just forego this kind of bias altogether. Surprise, surprise. That's not the way it works. Because computational procedures and algorithms rely on historical data that is itself shaped by long histories of discrimination and inequality, you get the same kind of output, unsurprisingly. And some people will argue, regardless of how you try to constrain or change the algorithm to account for this kind of inequality, for this kind of unequal outcomes. So this is where the bulk of the work on algorithmic systems has taken place. Now, these are extremely important topics. These are extremely important questions, and especially when we think about policy change, we need to talk about all of this. We need to talk about, in particular, privacy encroachments under the surveillance kind of mechanism, and we need to talk about bias and discrimination and how to address this, right, and how to curb it. This is extremely important. That said, it is not the approach that I'm taking in my work. And I take a different approach because I think that we cannot think that technological systems necessarily constrain us in a way where we have zero agency. And so instead, what I focus on in my research is this idea of algorithms in practice. So let me talk a tiny bit about what I mean by that. I look at the effects that algorithms have on the ground, or in the wild, or whichever metaphor you want to use to talk about algorithms not in the abstract sky of ideals, or in the kind of very sophisticated rooms of Facebook and Google, but rather what it looks like when we actually use these algorithmic systems in our day-to-day life. And based on this research, I argue that algorithms are always complex social symbols. Algorithms are never just algorithms. They always represent much more for the people who use them. In particular, algorithms take very different meanings depending on the institutional and social context where they unfold, right? For the people who use them, depending on the local priorities that they go through, algorithms will be interpreted in one way or in a completely different way. Context matters. Now, this idea that context matters is not new, also in the social sciences, and in many ways this is what French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu talks about as the logic of practice, right? And the idea with the logic of practice is that practice has its own logic. It's a bit repetitive, but that's kind of what it is. It's just that you can't really understand the world from the outside, because the way in which social actors go through their day-to-day lives will have its own logic, one that cannot be either understood or replicated by outside technocrats. And that's also a point that James Scott make in his kind of critical analysis of how states see the world. To understand the logic of practice, and here again, drawing on Bourdieu, one method is particularly adequate, and that's a method of ethnography. So I identify as an ethnographer, which means that I spend a lot of time with people. Just as I say, it's like I may have never worked in an office for any day of my life, but I love to see people work. I just really like it. I find it fascinating. I just don't want to do it myself. No, I'm kidding. But like, half kidding. I do love to see people work, and I'm trying to understand how people in the organizations that I study see the world, and try to understand how they understand the world. So I'll be talking a bit more about that, but just to give you a sense of the type of methods that I use. And based on this, the kind of underlying finding and the projects that drives this idea of algorithms in practice is that you will always find some kind of gap between the intended and the actual effects of algorithmic systems. So designers, so developers, the computer scientists who develop algorithmic systems have a couple of goals in mind, often influenced by user experience, employees, etc. But regardless of how much you try to predict what users will do, users will always come up with different ways of implementing these algorithms. So this, in turn, idea of a gap between the design and actual effects of algorithms comes, again, from a longer perspective, which takes place in STS, Science and Technology Studies. Many scholars have actually been based at UCSD, and so it's really exciting to be here. This is kind of the mecca of STS, so it's great. But this is basically what the kind of perspectives that I adopt in order to study the effects of algorithmic systems. And finally, I draw on a multi-sited research program. And that's the last aspect of my kind of this overview of my research that I want to talk about, which is that most people who study algorithms tend to focus on either one site or the world at large. And I think that there is a middle range in which we can kind of happily do things. And this is where my multi-sited approach comes in. Okay, so that was for the kind of introduction and the kind of questions I care about. Now let me get to the case studies that I'm going to talk about today. So as I said, I adopt a multi-sited approach, which means that I can just study about everything, or everything that I find interesting. And so today, I'm going to be talking about 3 case studies that I've been analyzing with this idea of studying how algorithms are used in practice, right? And the kind of unintended effect and unintended meanings that algorithms take when they when they unfold in a given institutional context. So 3 studies are, first, online news and web analytics software program. The second study is about criminal justice and risk assessment tools in criminal courts. And the third one is about YouTube and the demonetization bot among drama channels. So for those of you who don't know, let's see, how many of you know what drama channels are? Oh, lovely. Okay, I'll rely on you to kind of ask me really hard questions about drama channels and the James Charles controversy, which I'm always happy to dig into. Okay, so about these 3 case studies, let me just tell you a tiny bit about the kind of data that I draw on. So for the online news case, this is by far the most, the biggest research that I've accomplished so far. This was my dissertation work. It's a forthcoming book. I'll be talking a tiny bit more about it. I studied 5 web newsrooms in New York and Paris. I did a lot of interviews, a lot of observations. The second segment is about criminal justice. I studied 3 different criminal courts in the US, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast, one in the South. And this draws on previous work on criminal courts that I've done when I was, before I started my PhD back in France. I'll be talking a bit more about this. These are pictures I took. As you can see, I'm not the best photographer, but this gives you a sense of what these sites look like. And finally, the third site is about YouTube creators, drama channels. Again, I'm keeping the suspense intact. But one of the main difference here is because of the kind of distributed aspect of that site, I haven't done observations, only interviews. So that will inform some of the findings. Okay. All of these sites are anonymized. The people I cite are anonymized, with the exception of YouTube creators who strongly insisted that they wanted to be named by their own names. And I cleared that with the IRB. We're all good. I'm happy to name them. Okay. So I'm going to walk you through these 3 cases as quickly as possible, and then try to get a couple of lessons from there and draw a couple of conclusions about what we can learn by comparing how algorithms operate in 3 very different contexts. Okay? So let me start with online news. So it won't be a surprise for anyone in the room. Journalism and news production are undergoing a massive transformation. From the world of print newspapers and magazines to the world of online news, everything happened. Advertising revenues collapsed. And what became increasingly important in the world of online news are page views, or more accurately, number of unique visitors per month. And that is the case both for news websites that only rely on advertising revenues and for websites that rely on subscription models. I'm happy to talk more about that if there are questions. Now, one side effect of this increasing reliance on traffic as an economic model to make money for news websites is that they started paying really close attention to their online readers. And a booming market emerged for a specific type of software programs called web analytics software programs. So what web analytics software programs do is they draw on server data to track what readers are doing in real time and give journalists a sense of what readers are doing on their website at any given moment. So let me give you an example. This is Chartbeat. It is the most popular of all the analytics software programs being used right now across the world. It's used in more than 80 countries and by more than 75% of US publishers. So this is just in basically every single web newsrooms you can think about. Journalists and editors have this on their desktops and laptops. Now, what it does is, well, a couple of things. So first, it has a dial here that says concurrence. That's a concurrent number of visitors on the website at any given moment. As you can see, well, actually, you can't really see it, but it moves in real time. So here, it's like about 10,000, and it gives you a sense of how traffic as a whole is evolving on your site. Then you have a ranking of the most popular articles. So this is for Gizmodo. Used to be Gizmodo, and it has a ranking with the number of concurrent visitors of all the articles, and the numbers move as the number of visitors evolve. Then you have traffic sources, so you can see where visitors come from, internal social search, direct links, and finally you have more kind of information about visitors, and you have related tweets about the articles under consideration. So why does this matter? Well, it matters in a couple of different ways, and this is what I analyze in my forthcoming book, Metrics at Work, Journalism and the Contested Meaning of Algorithms, which is going to be published in June, which is very exciting. Yeah. Please buy it, please buy it. So it matters in a couple of ways, but I think the most important one is that it really changes the information landscape of journalists. So traditionally, journalists did not care much about their readers. And many studies of print journalism have showed that. Now, of course, newspapers have always done marketing studies about the readership of the publication, right? That was essential, well, not only to know who was reading it, but also to sell that information to potential advertisers who are placing ads in the newspapers. You had to be able to say, well, our audience is mostly urban, it's mostly male, it's mostly X, Y, and Z. You had to be able to have that information. And so that definitely happened. But several studies showed that up until the 90s and early 2000s, journalists refused to look at any kind of information about what readers wanted to read on the websites, right? In fact, there are very interesting anecdotal evidence that when journalists were sent letters to the editors by readers, they would always dismiss them as crazy or insane, right? So there was this idea that, like, no, you don't tell us what to do. We, as professionals, know what is newsworthy, right? And that goes with this idea of newsworthiness, which is really important in the journalistic landscape. Now, of course, web analytics change this attitude towards readership completely, because for the first time they put the preferences of the audience at the center of the journalist screens. In a way, it's like almost impossible to avoid. Journalists have to look at how many clicks did their article attract, were they in the top 10 most cited articles or not, or most emails, or most viewed, and of course they talk about it, right? They're like, oh, your article got 100,000 views, and mine only got 10,000. I wonder why, because And then they kind of compare different articles. So it's be like, well, but yours was about Beyonce, so of course it's going to get 10,000, whereas mine was about Iraq, so it's normal that it only got 5,000. So you have all of these discussions about what do these metrics mean. And in fact, one really interesting aspect of what these web analytics or audience metrics mean for journalists is that they systematically have a double meaning. On the one hand, journalists criticize them as market forces, right? They're like, oh yeah, well, I guess in order to make money, we need to have a certain number of unique visitors. And so, but that's for the publication, right? It's just like, it doesn't concern me necessarily. But at the same time, journalists care a lot about being read. After all, why would you become a journalist if you didn't want people to read your stuff? And I think that the academics in the room can certainly relate. We want people to read our articles. If you publish an article and only 3 people read it, well, perhaps something went wrong, right? Why are you doing your job? So it's kind of, or perhaps not, sorry, but I see people on the phone can be like that, no. Yeah, well, anyway. So web analytics say something about what I call algorithmic publics, which are these very kind of complex and distributed publics that are represented through algorithmic procedures. So this is kind of how I explore the question of the reception of these software programs providing detailed analytics about readers in web newsrooms. And I ask, how do journalists make sense of these analytic software programs? So to explore this question, I focus the analysis on 2 websites, which are anonymized. Usually people figure them out, but they are anonymized, and many people actually do not figure them out, which is pretty nice. The Notebook in New York and La Place in Paris. Now, there are lots of reasons why the 2 websites are comparable. I'm happy to talk more about that if people have questions. What's really interesting is that the 2 websites started using Chartbeat, the program I showed you, at the same time, at the turn of 2009-2010, which is a moment when the market for online news suddenly became much more competitive, in part because of the emergence of new types of websites that were extremely good and savvy at traffic maximization. And that's, in particular, the Huffington Post, Gawker. I mean, the Huffington Post is a big game changer here, but also Gawker and a couple of others, and Upworthy, et cetera, that just really kind of changed the rules of the games. So what did I find? So I spent a lot of time at these 2 websites. I sat with web journalists. I had lunch with them. I went to have drinks with them. I followed them in their work. I spent countless hours just sitting with them behind their desktops and looking at how they made sense of audience metrics and how they incorporated them in their work. And so I will start by saying that at the 2 websites on which I focus the analysis, journalists were extremely conflicted between 2 different definitions or ways of understanding their work, which I call editorial evaluation and click-based evaluation. So on the one hand, they thought that as journalists, it was their duty to publish important pieces that mattered, that changed how people were thinking about a given question, that covered breaking news and revealed new information, quality information to the public. And in that view, really, audience metrics didn't say much at all. What really mattered was the opinion of their colleagues and superiors. So the best things that a journalist, according to this editorial evaluation, could get is their editor-in-chief saying, hey, good job. This was a great article. Right? A bit like a professor telling you the same thing, right? It's just kind of this kind of system of peer evaluation, right? Well, really what mattered was the opinion of your colleagues and superiors. But at the same time, they also relied on a different repertoire to make sense of their work. And that's a repertoire that I call kind of click-based evaluation. And in that view, what really mattered was to capture the attention of the public. What really mattered was to engage with the public with either a kind of snappy, kind of fun headline, or a slideshow, or like cool pictures. What mattered was for the articles to go viral, to be kind of taken up on social media, to just explode on Twitter, Facebook, etc. And that was really what they cared about, right? So they would be like, oh, you know what, we need to change the headline, and what we're going to put here is literally this is going to blow your brain, or whatever, this is going to change your mind about this, right? And this is where like the kind of like clickbait-y type of headlines came from, and all of that kind of made sense within this kind of click-based mode of evaluation of what they were doing in their daily work. Now what was interesting is that in the two newsrooms, journalists kept switching back and forth between these two different ways of understanding their work, right? And so they would be like, you know, I think it's really important to talk about the civil war in Syria, when it was still a topic covered by a news website, which is not so much the case today. So it would be like, this is really important. And then they would be like, but no one's going to read it. So you see, when they did that, they basically switched from editorial evaluation to click-based evaluation. Conversely, during editorial meetings, which is when journalists kind of pitch their ideas, you know, they would say like, oh, so, you know, I really want to write about why, for example, some people get sick when they drink a specific type of alcohol. And then the editor-in-chief would be like, that's a really interesting topic, and it's going to get 1 million clicks. Right? And so here again, you see the same kind of switching back and forth between these two modes of evaluation. So a lot of kind of ambiguity and kind of ambivalence within the two newsrooms. At the same time, and turning to the differences between the newsrooms, I did find different uses and interpretations of Chartbeat at the French newsroom and at the American newsroom. And so let me just tell you a tiny bit about this and about what I think it means. So at the American newsrooms, journalists basically said, listen, we need to make money. If we don't make money, we're going to close, and you're all going to lose your jobs. So this is just, there is no discussion about it. It needs to happen, right? And so the way they reacted to that is that they established a strong division of labor between editors, so the top editors, and the staff members. So the top editors were like, listen, we're in charge of the economic well-being of this publication. The economic well-being of the publication involves having a high number of unique visitors. We're going to do everything it takes to get these numbers. That's our job. And in contrast, and so they work basically on Chartbeat all day long. Whereas staff writers were like, it's not my job to take care of traffic numbers. The audience has bad taste. I don't care about that. What I care about is writing good articles. The editors will take care of traffic number stuff. This is not my job. And a sentence that kept coming up was, my job is to write good copy. Good copy was what they kept talking about. So relying on this kind of editorial mode of evaluation that I mentioned before. So now, what about the Parisian newsroom? Well, the Parisian newsroom was fascinating, and that's not only because I'm French, it's also because they were deeply conflicted about things. So the way they talked about it, so first, like, they had this extremely critical repertoire, where they compared the chase for online traffic to prostitution, which in itself says something about the gender politics in France. It's just, I won't even get into it, but it was like, oh, we're selling ourselves, like trying to get eyeballs, trying to get clicks, this is so degrading, it's so bad, this is not why I became a journalist. So they all said that. But at the same time, they were obsessed with Chartbeat. They fixated on Chartbeat throughout the day. They would look at Chartbeat at night on their phones. They would say like, yeah, you know what, I checked in the middle of the night. I know I shouldn't have, but I went to the bathroom and my iPhone was there, and so I just kind of checked Chartbeat and I realized the numbers are so bad, I don't understand why people are not clicking, right? So a kind of like weird decoupling between a very critical discourse, but also fixation on analytics. And what was really interesting there is that so I was like, oh, but so why do you care so much? And they were just like, well, because I want to have an impact. And to have an impact, you need traffic numbers. And so they really interpreted traffic numbers as a signal of their relevance as public intellectuals, which in turn has a lot to do with the history of journalism in France. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about that if people have questions. And so basically, what's the lessons that we can take here, that we can get here? Well, is that in the case of journalism, I think, web analytics have a very kind of ambivalent and ambiguous set of meanings. On the one hand, they're criticized because they're seen as an encroachment of market forces on journalistic autonomy. And as such, they're deeply contested, rejected, criticized, etc. Because it's like, oh, we should be autonomous, we should be able to write on whatever we want, this is just clickbait, it's bad, it's degrading, we shouldn't do it. But at the same time, web analytics also have to do with the public impact of journalists. And journalists become journalists because they want to have a public impact, right? And so at the end of the day, journalists, depending on the newsroom where they are, the kind of position they have, their orientation towards their work, see different things in web analytics. They can see either the market or the public, which are two sides of the same coin, right? And that, again, has a lot to do with, the reason why they see one or the other has to do with journalistic traditions and kind of the position of newsrooms within the journalistic landscape, which is a whole other bag of beans. But the main point that I would like to emphasize here is this idea of ambivalence, that in web journalism, the algorithms that journalists look at, these web analytics software programs, will always be received with some ambivalence. Because at the end of the day, what they represent is unclear, or it's multifaceted, to put it differently, between this kind of idea of markets and publics. Okay, so let me move to the second case, criminal justice. So it won't be a surprise. You probably all followed the kind of recent coverage of predictive algorithms in criminal justice. There has been an explosion of software programs designed to assess the risk of recidivism in the criminal justice context. There are more than 60 of them in the US being used in the US right now. It has a longer history. It really started in the 1920s, in part with the Chicago School. There's a long history here. Let me just walk you through one specific risk assessment tool, which is the one I studied in my work. And I studied several, but this is one of them. So this is COMPASS, the correct, I won't be able, I will mess it up if I try to spell out the acronym. But basically it's used in probation, and it has also been used at the moment of sentencing within the criminal justice context. So basically what happens is that some kind of social worker will administer a survey to a defendant. And the survey will ask 137 questions, which look like this. So for example, tell me about your friends, who do you spend your time with, what are they like, have your friends ever gotten into trouble, for what, do your parents and caregivers like your friends, why not, and then estimate portion of your friends who have dropped out, drink, sell drugs, use drugs, are gang affiliated, have been arrested. And all of this information is then collected, and there is a little button here that says calculate risk, and the software program spits out a risk score that goes from 0 to 10 with a kind of color scheme. 10 is high risk, and the idea is that if the defendant is at a high risk of recidivism, they should be incarcerated in order to not reoffend. And low risk is between 1 and 3. And here the idea is that if they are low risk, they can be released, they will not reoffend, and they will not reoffend in a violent way. Now, there has been a lot of coverage of these predictive algorithms, and basically the way in which we can think about it is that different people have very different opinions about what these algorithms are supposed to do. So on the one hand, there is a kind of growing consensus that the criminal justice system needs to be reformed. And it needs to be reformed because there are more than 1.5 million, actually 2.1 million if you count jails, people behind bars, that the system is extremely discriminatory, that it's expensive, and that we need to do something. The problem is that doing something is politically risky. And so for many criminal justice advocates, one way of dealing with this political cost is to externalize the decision to release offenders to an algorithm, right? And so that's what people like Anne Milgram, who has been a prosecutor in New Jersey, calls moneyballing criminal justice, relying on smart data to moneyball criminal justice decision and really make more informed decisions that will help solve the problem of mass incarceration. Unfortunately, these algorithms are also biased. So you end up at square one. And this is one of the findings that journalist Julia Engwin reports in her groundbreaking article, Machine Bias, in which they did a quantitative analysis of a data set. I'm sure many of you have followed some version of this, showing that these risk assessment tools are biased in a specific way against African Americans. Unsurprisingly, given the data they draw upon, right? I mean, we could have predicted that, but yes. So there has been a lot of kind of takes and analysis of what these risk assessment tools do, whether they're biased, how they're biased, and how we can calculate bias. But surprisingly, relatively few studies of what happens on the ground. So how are these tools used in criminal courts? And so drawing on the previous work I had done in a criminal court in the French context, in which I had used another information technology, I decided to go take a look. And as I said, I went to 3 different courts and did more than 20 interviews with judges and prosecutors, and also informal observations with pretrial officers and probation officers in these jurisdictions. And what I found was that, in fact, far from the ideals that we live in kind of a minority report world, right, where the predictive algorithm spits a score and bam, you're sent to jail, this is not what happens. In fact, judges and prosecutors find many ways to not comply with the algorithms. In fact, they find many ways to not look at the algorithm. So let me walk you through the way in which these risk assessment tools, which again, it's like, you read the media coverage of it, it looks like RoboCop, right? It's just like Minority Report, woo, you're going to be arrested, sent to jail before having even kind of committed or thinking of reoffending, and that's the end of it. Well, so the way in which it works is that in a given courthouse, at some point, you will be administered a survey, right? So it depends on the risk assessment tool. Some risk assessment tools, you don't need to be administered a survey. Others, you do. There is some variation. Then the pretrial worker, who is a social worker, who kind of administers the survey, is going to fill up the information in the software program, click Calculate Risk, print out the page with the risk scores in black and white on an old printer, add the page with the risk score to the file of the defendant, which is usually 200 pages long, somewhere around page 130, close the file, put the file on a cart, push the cart to the hearing room, right, and give a pile like this, right, with all the defendants who are going to be seen that day to the prosecutors and the judges. Just like, off you go. So now, it's a bit of a joke, but it's not completely a joke. Because basically what I found is that, so it was this kind of hilarious moment of fieldwork where I was like, so how do you use risk assessment tools? And they were like, what? I was like, yeah, like these predictive algorithms. I know that you're using 3 of them. They were like, no, we don't. I was like, oh, yes, you do. It's on your website. So I'm like, no, we don't. I've never heard of this. So then I did some digging, kind of trying to find like where these risk assessment tools were used. Well, so in fact, like a more analytical way of saying this is that I found lots of resistance or buffering strategies on the part of legal professionals to basically not really deal with these risk assessment tools. So the 3 main resistance strategies were what I call foot dragging, gaming, and open critique. So on the part of judges and prosecutors, they were like, listen, we don't have time. We don't have time, we're not looking at it, we don't find it helpful. Anyway, we're looking at the same variables when we read the files of a defendant. So, it's not going to tell us anything. Perhaps if you were a new judge, straight out of law school, or a new kind of public defender, but I've been a judge for 20 years, I just don't need to use that. And so they just ignored it completely. That's kind of foot drag. The second one was gaming, and that was more in the kind of pretrial and probation department. So basically, social workers would find ways to kind of adjust the kind of information that they entered into the system to get risk scores that kind of match what they thought was adequate for a given defendant. And they were like, oh, he got a risk score of 8? That's not quite right. I know why. It's because it says that he has a history of drug abuse. But society doesn't really. I mean, marijuana, I'm making this specific case up, right? But basically they would be like, actually, this is a bit of a subjective thing. I'm going to go back to that page and just edit it, and I'm going to get a 5 as a risk score, and that seems more like it. So kind of like gaming or manipulation, at least, right? And finally, open critique, which is that all across the board, almost all the people I talked to were like, these things are useless. And plus, we've all read the ProPublica article that says they're biased against African Americans. So why should we use them? They're even more biased than we are. So I just don't really see the point. So that said, it's not to say that the use of these tools was necessarily completely innocuous, because in fact, another thing that I found is that discretionary power, which typically is really kind of mostly at the judge level and to some extent at the prosecutorial level, but judges are the ones making the decisions, moved to some extent to pretrial departments and technology teams. And so that, tools that are designed to make decision-making processes more objective, usually what happens is just that power finds a way to discretionary power finds a way to move to less visible places or other places within the organizations, and places that are less accountable and more difficult to reform. I'm happy to talk more about that if there are questions. And one again, so the main points that we can take from this analysis is that in the case of criminal justice, algorithms in the form of these risk assessment tools were met with a lot of resistance. Now, the question, of course, is well, why is that? Right? So in the case of journalism, we saw that there was some ambivalence, which has to do, I think, with the deeply conflicted nature of journalism as being both a public good and a commodity that needs to make some kind of money. So what's the deal in criminal justice? Well, here we can turn again to existing work in the sociology of law. And when we think about law, it has a lot to do with the rule of the precedent. Law and the administration of law have to do with things that have been established for a long time and that do not change very quickly. And so for many of the legal professionals I talk to, the idea of using a new technological form, one that was supposed to help them, but for which they hadn't been consulted in any kind of way, where they didn't understand where it came from, one that was built by for-profit companies using variables they disagreed with, was just completely useless, and something that they had no trust in. And as a consequence, they just refused to use it in all possible ways, right? Okay, let me just blitz through the third case studies, which is too bad because it's, of course, the one that is the newest, and so I'm just really fascinated by it. So this is a project that I'm doing with a graduate student who is also an amazing researcher in her own right, Becca Lewis, who has been studying the far right on YouTube and how the far right is becoming mainstream on YouTube. Okay. YouTube is fascinating for many reasons, but the one we're interested in is that they have what's called the YouTube Partner Program, which means that if you have enough public watch hours and a large enough number of subscribers, about 1,000, you can make money directly from the ads that YouTube serves on your videos, right? In other ways, compared to Twitter and Instagram, you can make money off YouTube. And so what that means is that a vibrant ecosystem of creators has emerged because YouTube is an easy way to make money. Is anyone in the room part of the YouTube Partner Program? I see that there is a debate between two people here, but perhaps that's no, I'm not. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. Okay, so as an academic, I have to say that after studying YouTube creators, I was like, I should create a YouTube channel and just, kind of change careers. Okay, so as part of this kind of vibrant ecosystem of content creators who make money off YouTube, we studied specifically on the case of drama channels. So drama channels are fascinating because they're like meta content creators. So what they do, they're YouTubers who cover drama and gossip between other YouTubers. So for most people above 30, you've never heard of the people they cover, and you've never heard of drama channels either, right? But let's just say that the moment when drama channels really exploded is during Dramageddon. Does anyone know what Dramageddon is? Please? I'm sure some of the students know. It's a James Charles versus Tati Westbrook controversy, during which Tati Westbrook accused James Charles of betraying her. Okay, all of this seems pretty cryptic, but it all has to do with beauty YouTube. So the beauty community on YouTube is extremely successful, extremely productive, and they mostly kind of post kind of makeup tutorials and also kind of more artistic creations, and they often do partnerships with makeup brands during which they kind of create their own line of beauty products. I see that some of you in the room are familiar with this. You kind of nod in approval. So they get massive number of page views, massive number of subscribers. It's a vibrant ecosystem. Now, because it's a vibrant ecosystem, there is also a lot of drama between YouTube creators, and that's where drama channel creators come in. They kind of cover, document, and analyze the conflicts and gossips and drama that takes place between all of these YouTube creators. And so what we did is we interviewed these drama channel creators, and we asked them lots of questions. But first, like, how did they make money? How did they create content? How did they choose which content to create? How did they interact with the celebrities they covered? And how did they see their role in the YouTube ecosystem? And more generally, how did they make sense of YouTube as a platform on which they made money? And the main findings that we had was that the drama channel creators that we talked to were extremely suspicious. They really felt that things were not stable and that they were being threatened of disappearing in the depths of the YouTube platform. So specifically, they were really up in arms about two types of algorithms. The first one is the recommendation algorithm, which is the one that recommends related video when you're on YouTube. If you watch a video, you're going to get like either up next or a list of related videos. And this recommendation algorithm is extremely powerful. A lot of people have written about it. But drama channels felt that their content was systematically being downplayed on YouTube and made invisible because it didn't show up as it should have been, the way it should have been, in their opinion, on the recommendation algorithm. The second algorithm that they got really annoyed by is the demonetization bot. So demonetization bot is a kind of automated process through which YouTube strikes down videos that it deems problematic in terms of content, right? That either because they use offensive language or offensive topics, or there are a range of different reasons why a video can be demonetized. And demonetization, so the bot automatically identifies which video will be demonetized. What demonetization means is that content creators will not make money on that video. So for them, being demonetized is an extremely costly process because it means that the videos they spent a week creating will not make money, right? And basically they can appeal the demonetization decision and the demonetization bot, but it takes about 3 days to a week to get some kind of resolution from YouTube. And given the way in which traffic works for these drama channels, it means that basically the money was gone. And that's money that went straight into YouTube's pocket. So they got extremely annoyed by that. So how did they make sense of these two algorithms? Well, A, they were very annoyed. But second, and that's a place where I think it was really interesting, they had an extremely, shall we say, they relied on conspiracy theories a lot to explain why, in their opinion, they were being discriminated against by the YouTube algorithms, right? Both the demonetization bot and the recommendation algorithm. And the narrative went kind of like this. Beauty YouTubers hate us because we try to hold them accountable. So James Charles, for those of you who don't know James Charles, Google, it's fascinating. James Charles hates us because we try to hold him accountable. He has lunch with the YouTube CEO, and he told the YouTube CEO that YouTube had to stop showing our content. And following that lunch, we can prove that our content has been submerged and kind of underplayed on the platform, and all our videos have been struck down by the demonetization bot, right? So a very personalized, emotional, conspiratorial view of how YouTube operates. Now, for those of you who have questions, YouTube actually does kind of, YouTube has a two-tier governance system, and some of these theories are kind of right about how it works, in the sense that not all YouTubers are treated the same. If you're a small YouTuber, you won't get the same kind of treatment in terms of demonetization than if you're James Charles. So, they're kind of right that there is a two-tier treatment. The conspiratorial aspect is just, to my knowledge, completely wrong. And I've tried a lot to get some kind of quote from YouTube confirming or not confirming this, and so far I am not allowed to say anything on record, so that's that. But I think that what's really interesting in this kind of conspiratorial mindset is that basically for all of these somewhat alienated content producers who work from home, most of them, and for whom YouTube is not only a central source of income, most of them have left their day job to do YouTube full-time, but also a really important community in terms of meanings and creating some kind of social bond with the other drama channels and the celebrities they cover and the audience that reacts to their videos. This kind of suspicious mindset towards algorithms and towards YouTube as a platform also goes hand in hand and has elective affinities. And here you can see that I'm kind of, it's a bit slippery, and that's why it's a work in progress, with the promotion of a worldview that is somewhat conspiratorial and radicalized. And so here I'm very influenced by Becca Lewis's work, which shows that radicalized content on YouTube thrives. And basically what we find in these interviews is that the economic and technological structures of the YouTube platform and the way in which algorithmic gossip works among these drama producers kind of goes well with conspiracy theories showing that, or saying that 9/11 never happened. It kind of, it's a slippery slope, is what I'm trying to say. And I will welcome many questions and many criticisms of that assertion. Okay, so let me conclude based on the 3 case studies that I've talked about today. So a first point, which I think could be a good fit, given the Design at Large theme of this seminar, is that we should be careful when we grant specific types of power to algorithmic systems. And that, in a way, the very the critiques that algorithms are destroying the social fabric mirrors somewhat like the mantra of Silicon Valley that algorithms are saving society. In both cases, we may give too much power to technological forms. Where I come in is saying, well, it's always an interaction between technological structures on the one hand and social, cultural, and political context in the other. And what happens in that encounter is kind of open-ended, not completely open-ended. There is, it goes in specific directions, but there is some messiness there that needs to be studied. And I gave 3 examples of that type of messiness, a very kind of rigorous sociological context, right? Messiness is the way to do it. Algorithmic ambivalence in the case of journalism, algorithmic resistance in the case of criminal justice, and algorithmic suspicion in the case of YouTube content creation. Now, you will have noticed that I point towards possible explanations for these different types of interpretations of algorithms, but I don't give a very solid, shall we say, organized, rigorous kind of 3-by-3 table explaining what are the main factors that drive like each of these reactions, right? And so I think that this is where there is much more research to be done. in terms of looking at how specific algorithmic systems, so specific features of algorithms, shape or not these kinds of outcomes. Second, looking at the implementation process, and that's where I think design also plays a role. Whether, how do you get buy-in from the people on which the algorithms are being unfolded, right? How do you negotiate with them what's a helpful algorithm, what's a productive algorithm, and what's not? And finally, paying close attention to all the forms of resistance, gaming, foot dragging, critique that takes place when these computational systems unfold in the wild. And so, just to finish, I think that what this means is that at a time when almost all of our interactions, well, many of our interactions, are mediated through these algorithmically fueled procedures, we need much more qualitative study of how they work. Refining the models is very important. Making sure that they don't obviously discriminate is very important. But looking at some of the unintended side effects that they can have is also central. And so I'll stop here.